Alright, so I got a bunch of different Israel updates here that I want to get to with you guys, starting off with this absolutely wild story that just unfolded over the last day or so. So as pointed out here by the New York Times, they say blast that killed about 20 soldiers, IDF soldiers, linked to Israeli effort to create a Gaza buffer zone. So this was the deadliest day for IDF soldiers since October 7th. So this is kind of a big deal for a couple of different reasons, obviously concerning their internal, domestic turmoil over the future direction of this war and certain pressures that are coming onto Benjamin Netanyahu to try to get the hostages back and maybe wrap it up at some point. But basically what looks like happened here, and we're going to read some of the details, but so Israel has been trying to set up what they're calling a buffer zone, which is really just them stealing Palestinian land inside of Gaza and emptying it completely, right? They say, oh, this is for safety concerns. I think the reality is that you are taking what was already one of the most impoverished, densely populated places on the face of the planet and cutting them off even more, packing them in even more than they already were in a completely illegal land grab, essentially. And so they've been going around, they've been doing controlled demolitions of various different civilian buildings. I think these were literally just civilian homes, and rigging them with explosions to do controlled demolitions, kind of similar to the video that I showed you guys a couple of days ago with one of the last remaining universities inside of Gaza that they similarly rigged with explosions and flattened to the ground. And so it looks like that's what was happening. And as they were in the midst of rigging some of these explosives, a Hamas militant, right, had an RPG and fired it in the direction of these soldiers and triggered some of these explosives to go off, killing, a couple dozen IDF soldiers. So just absolutely insane for so many different reasons. Like, number one, this is supposed to be in an area that you guys have said that you have, firm control over. What does it say that, a Hamas guy can just walk up with an RPG and shoot at you as you're trying to do a controlled demolition of Palestinian civilian homes? I mean, just this entire situation is absolutely wild. So a little bit of details. They say Israel was trying to demolish part of a Palestinian neighborhood, not a Hamas command and control center, okay? A Palestinian neighborhood, as it pursued a plan to create a buffer zone between Gaza and Israel, when around 20, and again, it's now about like 24 they've revised it up to, Israeli soldiers were killed on Monday in an explosion, according to 3 Israeli officials. The explosion on Monday occurred after a Gazan militant fired toward a tank that was guarding an Israeli unit that had been setting explosives inside these buildings on the border in central Gaza with the intention of demolishing them, according to a news briefing given by the Israeli military. In the firefight, the explosions went off, killing many of the soldiers inside, the military said. Israel wants to demolish many of the Palestinian buildings close to the border in order to create, again, this security zone, according to 3 officials who spoke anonymously. They say 2 of the officials said that Israel's goal was to create this buffer zone up to roughly 0.6 of a mile along the entire length of Israel's 36-mile border with Gaza. And as they point out here, at the narrowest point, the Gaza Strip is only 4 miles across. So you might look at that and say, oh, well, it's only 0.6 of a mile. But we're talking about 0.6 of a mile, over half a mile, when the width of Gaza in many places is only like 4 or 5 miles wide. And you're going to create that entire half a mile or so long strip and demolish everything that's within that on the entirety of the border with Israel. I mean, it's not a small amount of land grabbing that we're talking about here, of just demolishing all civilian infrastructure that is there in the name of security, as if this is going to make you more secure. I mean, it's utterly ridiculous. They say the idea of a buffer zone, it's even opposed by the United States, by the way, gained such momentum in Israeli discourse that the State Department spoke out against it back in December because it would effectively reduce the size of Gaza, which is openly opposed by the U.S. administration. Now, again, what are you going to do about it? Are you actually going to stop them from doing this now that it's been confirmed they are 100% creating this buffer zone and reducing the size of Gaza? No. I mean, they're not doing absolutely anything to actually pressure Israel on this front or on any front for that matter. They say John Kirby, a spokesperson for the NSC, repeated that objection on Tuesday when asked about this at a news briefing on Israel's moves to create this buffer zone, saying, "We do not want to see the territory of Gaza reduced in any way. We won't support that." Okay, again, what does it mean we won't support that? Does that mean you're not going to give them the weapons to continue doing this? I mean, what does that actually mean? It just means rhetorically we're not going to support it. We're going to give them a little finger wag and say, "Tss, tss, tss, you guys better stop that. stop that right now. That's not good. That's bad. And then that's it. And, oh, by the way, we're still going to send you the weapons. We're still going to give you cover at the UN. We're still going to, aid and abet in this entire process in every way, shape, and form. But just rhetorically, we're going to say we're against it. They say to Palestinians, this practice is cruel and would keep Gazans in an already crowded enclave from being able to return their homes. I mean, again, this isn't to Palestinians. This is just objectively what is actually happening right now. Yes, they would be, unable to return to their homes if their homes are demolished. That's kind of just a fact there, right? They say critics of Israeli policy say that the practice is part of a wider disregard for civilian housing and property. Oh, you don't say. The majority of Gaza's buildings have been damaged during this war. The majority of Gaza's buildings have been damaged or destroyed, many of them destroyed. The majority in the northern portion of Gaza have been destroyed, or it's uninhabitable at this point. So yeah, I mean, to say that they've, had somewhat of a disregard for civilian housing and property is kind of the understatement of the century. And they finish off here. The United States Special Rapporteur on the right to adequate housing said a systematic demolition of Palestinian border homes could constitute a war crime because there's no immediate threat to Israel. Again, I mean, they're openly saying this is not, oh, we need to do this because Hamas is living inside of these homes. No, that's not what we're talking about. These are just civilian homes that they are preemptively going and destroying in order to basically do a giant land grab inside of Gaza. Now, I'd be surprised if their goal, from what the statements we've seen from guys like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, that their goal wouldn't even be beyond that and to conquer and to resettle even larger portions of Gaza. We've seen the bulldozers. We've seen the flattened, pancaked buildings. We've seen the statements that have come up from, high-ranking politicians in Israel who have openly stated that that's exactly what they want to do. So, I would honestly be surprised if this half a mile long border, buffer zone or whatever is the only extent that they go. But we also had this update here as well. In the aftermath of those 24 or some odd soldiers being killed, Israeli forces storm hospital as Khan Yunis hit by the bloodiest fighting of 2024. So a little bit of details on this. So, I mean, keep in mind, this is one of those regions where they initially said you should flee there, right? You should flee the north. You should go to these other places. Go to Khan Yunis. You should go to Mawasi, which they're going to mention in this article as well. Go to all of these places. Those are the new safe zones. And then it's like, okay, we're expanding our operations here. This is the new Hamas command center, so we have to go here. There's nowhere that has ever been a safe zone in the entirety of Gaza. Not a hospital, not a mosque, not a church, not a UN, shelter or school. Nowhere in Gaza has ever been an actual safe zone. They've just been playing this game. Oh, let's just shift the pieces around the board and tell people to go to different locations and then bomb those locations, right? So we're talking about Khan Yunis here. They say Israeli forces advancing deep into western Khan Yunis in Gaza's bloodiest fighting so far in January stormed one hospital and put another under siege on Monday, cutting off the wounded from trauma care. Okay? Remember when we had that entire debate for a week and a half on whether or not they bombed that other hospital, the Al-Ali hospital, and Israel would never bomb hospitals. We would never attack hospitals. That's a sacred place right there. And then, I mean, we've had dozens of hospitals that have been attacked at this point. Just here in this story alone, they have one hospital under siege, and they've stormed the other hospital. These are some of the only remaining, even marginally functional hospitals left within inside Gaza. The vast majority are not functional at all. Okay, as we are having massive amounts of innocent civilians who are being maimed, who are being killed, who need urgent care, and there's also that shortage of medical supplies as well. So, I mean, this is part and parcel of their strategy. Attacking hospitals is not something where it's maybe if there's one tiny example where it's an extreme example, a rocket is being fired from this hospital, we have no choice but to attack it. That's not what's going on here. When you attack every single hospital in Gaza, it's pretty clear that your goal is not self-defense, right? But they say troops advanced for the first time into the Al-Mawasi district. This is where they told him to go. This was that area that people were talking about where it's everybody needs to go to Al-Mawasi, right? This area that's almost the size of an airport is what it was compared to. Now they're attacking that as well. Troops advancing, not to mention the bombs that have dropped there previously. Okay, near the Mediterranean coast, west of Khan Yunis, the main city in southern Gaza, there they stormed the Al-Khair hospital and were arresting medical staff. Gaza Health Ministry spokesperson told Reuters. They say that Kijra said that 50 people were killed overnight in Khan Yunis, while the sieges of medical facilities meant dozens of dead and wounded were beyond the reach of rescuers. They also say that the Israeli occupation is preventing ambulance vehicles from moving to recover bodies of martyrs and the wounded in western Khan Yunis. So arresting medical staff, blocking the ambulances from getting to wounded people. Got it. They say the Palestinian Red Crescent said tanks had surrounded another Khan Yunis hospital, Al Amal, headquarters of the rescue agency, which had lost contact with its staff there. And they say they're deeply worried about that for obvious reasons. I mean, this is another thing Israel has been doing consistently, is attacking international aid organizations. They say Israel says that Hamas fighters operate in and around the hospitals, which Hamas and medical staff deny. I mean, you can't just pull that out on every single building inside of Gaza, right? And part of what they've done throughout this, I mean, obviously they say, oh, Hamas militants are everywhere. Hamas is literally everywhere in the Gaza Strip. No, wherever we have dropped a bomb, preemptively we're going to say, okay, there must have been Hamas there by definition because we bombed there, right? That's effectively what they're doing. But they also use, dirty tricks, in addition to that, to basically make the argument of like, well, if this residential tower where potentially hundreds of people, families live, and there's offices inside of the building, right? If there is one office in that building that is associated with the civilian portion of Hamas, because Hamas is the government, it's not just the militant wing, right? There are civilian Hamas offices and, government officials everywhere inside of Gaza. And so they'll take that and they'll be like, well, this has an association with Hamas, therefore it's a valid target. Therefore, by extension, the entire building is a valid target, and we have the right to flatten it to the ground for military purposes. I mean, these are the kinds of defenses that we see. And they say residents said that the bombardment from air, land, and sea was the most intense in southern Gaza since the war began in October. Okay, most of Gaza's 2.3 million residents are now penned into Rafah, which is at the southern border near Egypt, and just south of Khan Yunis, and Deir Balah, just north of it, crammed into public buildings and camps of tents made from plastic sheets lashed to wooden frames. 2.3 million people penned into the tiny portion in the very south of Gaza. This is just a mass ethnic cleansing of millions of people that we have seen. This is why they say, upwards of 87, 90% of the civilians in Gaza have been internally displaced. We're talking about an entire, Nakba 2.0 at an even greater scale than the original one. They say lines of cars and donkey carts piled high with belongings pushed south as Gazans sought to flee the bombardments. One person saying this is the 7th time that I've gotten displaced. Okay, weeping in her car, surrounded by her possessions. We also had Ahmad Abu Shawish, a boy, described sheltering in the Al-Aqsa University only to find it coming under attack, saying, quote, "We hardly made it out. We didn't expect the tanks at the university's gates." They say Gaza has had no communications or internet service for 10 days, hampering ambulance dispatches and to areas targeted by Israel and preventing people from checking in on one another and as to the whereabouts of the Israeli forces, and also making it more difficult to get information to the outside world. They say at Nasser Hospital, the only major hospital still accessible in Khan Yunis and the largest still functioning in Gaza, video showed the trauma ward overwhelmed with wounded being treated on a floor splashed with blood. Okay, so there's essentially no hospitals inside of Gaza that are still functional, right? Many of them have been destroyed. Many of them have been put under siege. Many of them have been essentially conquered and taken over by Israel. But with the very few that do remain, they're completely overcrowded. They have no medical supplies to work with. They're doing amputations and surgeries on people without anesthesia. You have hundreds, if not thousands of people packed in there, literally doing surgeries like on the floor. I mean, this is just an absolutely unimaginable situation that we are witnessing, not just witnessing, but that our government is actively supporting. I mean, it's grotesque, and I can't even show you some of the things that I've seen. But I mean, the other day, there's a video floating around that I obviously can't show on YouTube, but it was a man who was a doctor who was having to literally perform an amputation on his own daughter whose leg had been partially blown off with no anesthesia, holding her leg over a bucket. Okay, that's the kind of shit that we're talking about. That's being done in our name with our weapons inside of Gaza. And they say, of course, the health system has collapsed. There is no way for injured Palestinians to be treated in the Gaza Strip, and they're also not able to leave Gaza for treatment on the outside. And then they also mention here, outside, men were digging graves within the hospital grounds because it's not even safe to venture out to the cemetery, because then you'll have Israeli snipers taking pot shots at them. So you can't even go to bury the dead. Speaking of cemeteries, another story that recently dropped, IDF said to heavily damage 16 Gaza cemeteries during military operations. So CNN actually embedded with the IDF inside of Gaza. And while CNN was with them, so they're not hiding this, right? They had a major international, news organization with them, and they were just destroying cemeteries inside of Gaza. In some of these instances, they were digging bodies out of the ground, just desecrating cemeteries. And then in some circumstances, they'll say, oh, well, we wanted to establish a military outpost here, so therefore it's a valid military target. I mean, come on. This is part of the destruction of not just the, life inside of Gaza, but the culture, the history inside of Gaza. It's really an all-encompassing thing. I don't know how you could possibly, otherwise justify destroying 16 cemeteries. I mean, what possible military goal could you have for that? The decline of deaths in Gaza. This is how this is being reported in the Western media, by the way. I mean, I had to point this out just because of all of that stuff we were just referencing here, all of the death and destruction that is still ongoing at a historic pace. This is how the New York Times runs one of their major headlines: the decline of deaths in Gaza. The daily death toll in Gaza has fallen in half over the past month, reflecting a change in war strategy. Does what I just read to you guys seem like it's a change in the war strategy, where they're raiding hospitals in Khan Yunis, where we had like 50 people die just yesterday in Khan Yunis? You may look at a chart and say, well, a month ago it was much, much worse. More people were dying every day a month ago. But to frame it in this way is utterly disgusting. I mean, even just going based on these statements of guys like Benjamin Netanyahu and the rest of his war cabinet, they're not planning to wrap this up anytime soon. I mean, if anything, he has a direct political incentive to save his own ass from potential, the demise of his political career, or also even criminal punishments. Benjamin Netanyahu has an incentive to carry this on as long as he possibly can, and to expand it to maybe even going and fighting with Hezbollah, for example. So, I mean, the idea of, oh, we're going to portray this as a change in the war strategy. Israel's finally listening to Biden and they're caring more about civilians, avoiding them as desperately as they can. I mean, does this look like that's the reality to you guys? 32,246 killed so far. 32,000. That's a new mark that we just passed. Almost up to 13,000 children out of those. 62,000 injured. Again, over 100 journalists. Almost the entire population displaced. 169 press headquarters, 326 schools, including all of those major universities I mentioned, 657 healthcare professionals, 208 healthcare facilities. I mean, 250 mosques, 3 churches, 199 heritage sites, civil defense workers, thousands of people detained, forcibly disappeared. Who knows what's happening to them? We've seen all of the reports of torture of random innocent civilians, kids in some circumstances that have been arrested by Israel. So it doesn't look like it's winding down to me. It doesn't look like there's a change in strategy here, right? I mean, again, just as a reminder, the demolishing of this major university. I mean, it was a controlled demolition, right? This wasn't, we're in the heat of battle and Hamas is hiding inside the university, we have to airstrike it. No, this was they got in there. They set up the explosives, similar to the guys who just got fucking blown up because they were doing the same to Palestinian, neighborhoods in Khan Yunis. But, I mean, they go in there, they set up the explosives, they rig it, and then they step back and they blow it up. In some circumstances, I've seen videos of IDF soldiers, and I'm going to do an entirely different video on all of the wild TikToks I've seen recently, but, Israeli soldiers filming themselves, gleefully blowing these things up, bragging about the ethnic cleansing that they are participating in. Some of them dressing up in costumes. I mean, they're enjoying themselves, right? Gaza municipality. Israel's military uprooted 70% of Gaza's trees and bulldozed thousands of dunums of agriculture land in Gaza. Uprooted 70% of Gaza's trees. Were the trees Hamas as well? Is that what we're saying now? I mean, this is, again, it's to destroy the possibility of Gaza being livable for Palestinians. Period. That's what this is. You don't go around destroying trees as a military objective. I mean, look at this. They have like militarized bulldozers out here destroying farmland. Why are you doing that? Is that to get Hamas, or is that to destroy Palestinian life inside of Gaza? By the way, as they're in the midst of mass starvation of hundreds of thousands of people, if not at this point almost the entirety of the population, who are going hungry because there isn't enough food getting into Gaza, because, oh, by the way, you guys are rejecting a vast majority. A recent report said upwards of 70% of the aid that is supposed to be getting into Gaza. You're refusing to allow that aid in, so they're starving. There's no medical supplies. There's diseases that are currently spreading. And meanwhile, you're going out of your way to destroy the trees in Gaza, the universities, the schools, the hospitals inside of Gaza, the cemeteries. You can't even die in peace inside of Gaza. I mean, Jesus fucking Christ, man. We also had, just to finish off the video here, some updates in terms of potential hypothetical negotiations for an end to the war. Netanyahu rejects Hamas deal to end the war and release the captives. I mean, again, he has a direct incentive to not end this war. His political incentive is to sacrifice the remaining Israeli hostages inside of Gaza in order to perpetuate this war. Because, I mean, you look at the details of what's being offered here. I mean, he's rejected a proposal by Hamas to end the war and release captives in exchange for withdrawing Israeli forces, releasing prisoners, and accepting the arms group's governance of Gaza. So if you look at that and you think that that's crazy, let's just break it down here real quick. To end the war, yes, there needs to be a ceasefire. There needed to be a ceasefire months ago at this point. You cannot look at the amount of civilian death and destruction inside of Gaza and say, oh yeah, this war is going great. We're really getting Hamas. We're really defeating them. No, it's just a mass slaughter of innocent Palestinian men, women, and children, disproportionately women and children, who make up a majority of those killed, almost 2/3 of those killed, women and children. The destruction of all of these buildings inside, you cannot possibly make the argument that there doesn't need to be a ceasefire right now. And they also want to release the captives, okay, the Israeli captives, for withdrawing Israeli forces, again, part of a ceasefire. Yes, that needs to happen. Releasing prisoners and accepting the arms group's governance of Gaza. So releasing the prisoners, many of the prisoners they're talking about here are just, again, random innocent civilians who have been arrested or taken hostage effectively, either inside of Gaza or inside the West Bank, where they've also been doing this. So yeah, you need to have a prisoner swap. That's how this thing goes. This is how it's been done in the past numerous times. Even during this most recent offensive, we've seen Hamas give up some of their hostages in exchange for Palestinian prisoners being released. So, I mean, it's hostage for hostage. That's how this shit goes. So that, to me, is entirely reasonable. And also, accepting the armed groups, accepting Hamas's governance of Gaza. I mean, listen, I don't like Hamas. I'm not a fan of Hamas. But this is just reality. I mean, this is basically like, the same thing as the United States and Afghanistan almost, where there's just years and years and years where we don't even know, how well is this operation going? What is the end date for this operation? Is it even possible to displace the Taliban? No, and it turns out that it's not. And then we end up leaving, and then, they come back into power inside of Afghanistan, and now the Taliban is the ruling, governing party of Afghanistan. So there are certain situations where even if you don't like the group at hand, you have to recognize the realities of what is happening on the ground. It is not possible for Hamas to be displaced from power with a military campaign. It's not possible. And at this point, that's not even just my opinion. That's also been echoed by US military officials and even some Israeli politicians. If you want to defeat Hamas, if you want to remove Hamas from power, then fix the underlying conditions that allowed for Hamas's rise in the first place. And I mean, remember, Benjamin Netanyahu propped up Hamas, okay? Many Israeli politicians on the far right, including himself, viewed Hamas as an asset, because with Hamas in power, they could keep them down, and they could keep the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza separated to try to prevent the possibility of a Palestinian state. Maybe if you didn't want Hamas in power, you shouldn't have propped them up for all of this time. Maybe you shouldn't have continued the illegal expansions inside of the West Bank, the attacks on Al-Aqsa Mosque, the attacks on Palestinians in the West Bank, and the endless mowing the lawn in Gaza, killing civilians, bombing civilian infrastructure on a regular basis. End the occupation, end the siege, solve the underlying conditions, give Palestinians true autonomy and dignity and respect, and then Hamas would have no reason to exist. Okay? Hamas is an idea. It is a representation of violent, struggle against Israeli occupation and apartheid. That's what it is. Again, you don't have to agree with their charter, you don't have to agree with their statements or their ideology. That's why Hamas exists in the first place. So you have to address those underlying things in order for anything in the long term to ever improve, right? So this is the deal that he's rejecting here, right? Saying that, all of the soldiers would have fallen in vain if he accepts this deal. I mean, whose fault is that? Whose fault is that all of these IDF guys are getting blown up inside of Gaza? It's your fault. It's your fault, both for your security failure on October 7th that led to that attack being as significant as it was, because, part of the reason why October 7th was as, there was that much carnage on that day was because the Israeli military didn't have as much security on the border of Gaza that they otherwise would have, because they were too focused on expanding the illegal settlements in the West Bank. right? So you're to blame for the broader context in which October 7th happened. And you're also to blame for these soldiers who you are sending into this meat grinder to go die inside of Gaza for a completely failed objective here. That is not even possible. And you're also risking, in the meantime, your own hostages dying inside of Gaza. We know already that Israel has killed numerous, amounts of their own hostages inside of Gaza. They shot 3 guys who were holding up white flags and took their shirt off to show they didn't have any explosives, no weapons, yelling in Hebrew. They killed them in cold blood inside of Gaza. Another mother recently came forward to claim that the IDF had killed her son, who was in a tunnel of sorts, with toxic gas. I mean, other reports of, some of the hostages who have made it back to Israel as a part of some of those previous deals, who come back and they say, we can hear your airstrikes. You don't know where the fuck we are inside of Gaza. You were bombing at our locations. You're going to kill them. So, I mean, this is not a conspiracy. This is what's happening. You are more likely to end up killing your own hostages at this rate than you are to save them, to rescue them from Gaza. That's just an objective fact at this point. And so we've had some significant pushback here. This was one of the videos that was coming out of some of the parents who are fed up with this shit and are storming some of these government meetings to demand that a deal is made to return, some of these hostages back to Israel. It is possible. It's a choice that has to be made. But again, it's a difficult choice for Netanyahu, when in the back of his mind, he's saying, well, if there's some sort of a deal to get these hostages back inside of Israel, well, then that might mean an end to the war, and that might mean, that my political career is over, and maybe I'll even end up in jail. We also had Hamas that was rejecting one of the Israeli offers, but basically the Israeli offer was like, you need to give up your top Hamas leaders inside of Gaza, a surrender, essentially. They, a refusal to pull out Israeli troops from Gaza. So, that's something that Hamas is never going to accept in any way, shape, or form. So, it doesn't look good in terms of pushing for some sort of a resolution here between Hamas and Israel. And then I'll finish off with this, a little bit of brighter news, I guess, if you could even have some in this kind of a conversation. But the European Union is now urging member states to impose consequences on Israel if Netanyahu continues to oppose Palestinian statehood. Obviously, with all of those, various statements that he's made, from the river to the sea, we will have total Israeli control to the west of the Jordan River. So he's been repeatedly saying that. Biden is still in denial, insisting, oh no, he would agree with a 2-state solution. Trust me, I can convince him. Just utter and complete blanketed delusion from the Biden administration. He's being very clear. This has been his position in opposition to a 2-state solution for the entirety of his political career, for decades now at this point. And so, it's good that there's a little bit of extra added pressure out here. Now, you need not only the European Union, you need the United States of America. You need Joe Biden to actually eventually get fed up with Benjamin Netanyahu spitting in his face. Maybe even if it's as simple as his worrying about his own political future here in the U.S. as his poll numbers are tanking off of a cliff by aiding and abetting in a genocide. Maybe there's some breaking point where Biden decides, hey, this strategy of finger wagging at them behind the scenes while sending them weapons and using no leverage whatsoever and giving them protection from the international community, maybe that's not a good strategy, right? So I can cross my fingers and hope that eventually there's going to be some sort of a wake-up call for Joe Biden. Maybe there's enough internal turmoil inside of Israel from some of these hostage families or from, Israeli society as a whole. But it's certainly, contrary to what the New York Times was trying to claim here, doesn't seem to be ramping down.